I want to kick off because with one thing that made me laugh so much in particular, and that's every time Richard E. Grant finishes a sentence by calling someone amigo. And I just think that's just this little nuance of a character who is obviously just so disconnected from like how people should interact with each other. I'm curious to know, what was it about the word amigo that landed for you perfectly, and what was it sort of like writing an antagonist who has such a disconnect from almost reality ultimately?
Oh man, like you have no idea how much that touches my heart. I'm gonna tell my editor that because I remember I that was like a little flourish that was like when we were casting the movie. I don't know. I tried to really like put my mind in like who's saying this, and at different times I was like when before we knew like oh it was gonna be Richard. Like that was one that I put in. I feel like right around when we were like going to Richard. I was like oh yeah, like that's. And I remember when we shot. That scene where he's like in his sick bed and
Mm.
he says amigo the first time I believe we hear him say amigo. My editor just I remember he strung that out. Just like all of the takes of him saying amigo because we all thought it was like the funniest thing. Anyhow, I don't know what your question was. What how did I put decide to have him say amigo?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I mean that's I don't know. That character is just like a really fun voice. He kind of jumped off the
Mm.
page. It was one of the first voices that kind of like came out really clear in my mind. There's something about him that's like really into cultural appropriation. Like he's
Mm.
wearing like a Japanese hanten. He has all these like masks, like African masks as artwork around a lot. There's a lot of cultural appropriation that character gets into. That's kind of his thing in some ways, but like through the lens of like appreciation, like totally unself-aware. Like it's a real like cultural consumption colonialism dressed up as like appreciation for those cultures. I don't know when Amigo first came into a script, but it was one of those things that just like, I mean, every time Richard said it, it killed me on set because he just has such conviction. Richard really knows how
Yes.
to like deliver a joke as in the most like deadpan, earnest, like, no, no, no. He really thinks this is his friend in a way, but in a way that like all friends are disposable to him. And so yeah, I don't know. That was one that like flitted in and out of the script. And then when we got Richard in the role, I was like, well, I know that has to be something that, Richard is like a really like incredible way of delivering dialogue that sometimes is like so precise that like he really like dials in and if you are very specific about wording sometimes he like really refines that and like and delivers it in a really like there's a couple words that I was like intentionally putting on the page in a funny way that he totally like was like I see how this is written and I see how I'm going to do it in my own interpretation of this
It's
specificity.
it's so funny as well. Like you brought up that lack of self awareness with the characters, the self awareness that someone like Richard has to play a character like that is just like this perfect marriage. But I mean, there's credit that has to be given to Will and Taya as well because the way they deliver their dialogue in that same sort of lack of self awareness way is hilarious. But I'm curious to know what that process or how enjoyable the process is as a writer with creating sort of like unlikable antagonists who have to also have this substance to them. They have to believe that what they're doing is right. So we believe what they think they're doing is right. So is there a bit of fun to sort of write an unlikable character like that who actually has a lot of substance to them with all three of those characters?
Yeah, I mean it's a challenge. It's
Mm.
like the movie exists in a heightened kind of theatrical context, and that was always like part of the fun of it. And yet within that, like, you want to find a real kind of psychological grounding for their dynamic as a family unit. And I think as long as they were all grounded to this family unit and each other, they could kind of all be in the stratosphere or a little bit more heightened. And then because they were kind of their relationship to each other kind of brought them into a same level playing field almost.
Yeah.
That was sort of the hope at least. But yeah, I don't know. I got so lucky with all those characters those actors rather who really understood how to play the jokes with a straight face and just deliver what are heightened characters and yet somehow still grounded or still somehow based in a real psychology that hopefully resonates and makes it that much more funny when they're so unaware.
It is. It is so funny. And I think that's when connecting as an audience is like what we need. We need to believe that they're real in this world. And I think you do that so well with all the characters. But I think that also comes across in this like fun mythology you get to play with. And I'm curious to know sort of when you are writing the script and you're creating this mythology around the unicorns and their powers and everything like that, how much of that comes from mythology you've read, and how much is that you getting to sort of now play in your own unique playground?
Um, I mean, it's both. I had no relationship to unicorns prior to
Sure.
writing the script, so I really just like, and I had the movie started with the seed of the opening sequence, and
Mm.
that was just like I had no idea where it was going from there, and I just kind of started researching unicorns because it was something about that scene and the idea of hitting a unicorn with your car that was like really, I don't know, potent and felt like nothing I'd seen in a movie before.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that led me into just researching a lot of unicorn mythology. And then the fun became how to synthesize that down and recontextualize certain elements. And I kind of tried to make it. The thing I kept thinking about was like, it's almost like we're playing telephone with the past. I don't know. Does the game of telephone, is that like
Yeah,
a thing?
yes, yes.
Really?
Yeah, the
Okay.
whispering game. Yeah, almost. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so like the sort of thing that was like, okay, well, we think of them as rainbow. So like, how could that be grounded in something that feels a little more true or animalistic? It was like, oh, maybe there's an opalescence to the meat. Because you see that with
Yeah.
certain, to their flesh. You see that with certain animals, like especially more seafood, really, or
Mm.
seafood fish.
Yes.
Aquatic life, not it's not meant for eating, I suppose. I guess I'm just picturing like abalone. But you get that idea of like, how can you ground it and yet kind of incorporate the things that we might associate with it. And then it sort of became the synthesis of like, you know, in a lot of Eastern cultures, for example, unicorns are associated with like celestial bodies. So
Right.
that sort of brought in. I knew I wanted it to be in the Canadian Rockies. I really like that kind of sense of wilderness, and so then I was like, oh, the Aurora Borealis, that's there. The celestial associations.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's something that like is sort of invented, but it's all rooted in research to some degree, and an idea of trying to connect it somehow back to you know uh, lore from antiquity, and honestly, pulling from a lot of different cultures. That's kind of the fun thing about unicorns is so many people, so many different cultures have had unicorns in their history,
Mm.
and so there's a lot of disparate sources and disparate versions that you kind of can pull your own version together in a way.
How much did that then influence pulling all of that to your own version, the actual design of the unicorns as well? What was that process sort of like, and the collaboration with the designers to bring that to life?
It was tremendous. I mean, that was like the thing. I got really sad when we had to be done designing the creatures because we were like, okay, we gotta start building these VFX, these 3D models, and then we gotta
Yeah.
start building puppets. And I was like, oh man, this is the most fun. No, it was all very research based. I mean, I think where I started with was research from antiquity, and then I started trying to, it was important that they felt like real animals.
Mm.
And so I tried to pull from the research, and then also tried to ground it in real animals and kind of give them a sort of like almost prehistoric kind of bent to them.
Yeah.
So for example, like when you look at like a rhinoceros and you look at like photos of or renderings of like a woolly rhinoceros, or you look at an elephant and a mastodon, it was like, what's the horse version of that? And then that leads you to start looking at like Icelandic horses because they have this like wintry coat.
Right.
And then you start looking at different horse breeds like Percherons and Belgian draft horses, and then you go back into prehistoric. There are these prehistoric horses called Equus gigantus, which were these enormous horses that were like very, very large. But then you
Wow.
combine that with a lot of the research of like, the accounts of unicorns from antiquity. There were a lot of people that were describing them, like Pliny the Elder described them as having like elephantine hooves and a tail like a boar. And
Mm.
so you start pulling these sort of references together, and you sort of try and find like the through line. And then again, like I said, you try and keep it grounded in like they're real animals. So I didn't want it to have just like fangs on fangs on fangs. But
Yeah.
what we did find was like we were looking at different animal teeth, and we looked at mandrills, and they have a really interesting like the front of their teeth is flat, which looks a lot like a horse teeth, and then they have these
Interesting.
fangs. So that was sort of the basis for the front of the mouth. And then we
Right.
realized they're carnivorous, so they needed to have like, and we wanted to have their jaws be able to open wide. Horses' mouths don't open very wide. So
No.
then we started looking at like wolves, sort of like a mandrill in the front with like a horse in the very, very front, and then wolves in the back. So it's that sort of process that's just like super iterative and really fun to just explore. Like I said, I could have done it forever. It was the most fun just iterating and playing. And, we tried to give each of the three unicorns their own kind of distinct vibe that were
Mm.
sort of based on different eras of like unicorn mythology. The foal is kind of more like a medieval unicorn in
Right.
description, which is very goat-like. The
Mm,
mare is more equine, which is kind of like a contemporary unicorn description. And then the stallion is more of a brute, which kind of goes back to some of the oldest accounts of unicorns, which were more associated, honestly, with rhinoceros, Indian rhinos, but also aurochs.
mm.
The Hebrew word that became unicorn actually was re'em, which meant wild oxen, which historians now think was aurochs. And so he has like
Right.
kind of a shoulder geometry that kind of looks more like an aurochs. Anyhow, I just gave you way too much information.
No, it's perfect because it made me realize as you were talking about, it's like even the way the unicorns, especially the stallion and the mare, do the kills in this film relate to their physical movement and sort of what you were describing there. There is so much intricacy in that. And I know you were just talking about how you would love to have designed them forever, but I'd love to get what that moment was like for you when you then did see the final product, when you saw a physical unicorn for the first time that was created by this team after all that work. What was that experience like for you?
I mean, first it was we did concept art, we did early designs with Weta Workshop in New Zealand, actually.
Love it.
Then and that was like while I was still writing the script, because we realized it was gonna be so important to present it to actors and everyone like with this sense of like, here's what we're gonna have.
Sure.
Um, and then our partners at Zoic Studios kind of redid those designs. We took some of the discoveries from Weta, and they redid them and built the 3D models. And then we built puppets off of those with film effects in Budapest. So I don't know. The first time I saw the designs, the final designs, it was so cool because the animator started, they do these like turntables where you just see it in kind of rotating and movement. And you get to see them in these initial poses. I do think there was like a really crazy moment when one of the things I really was pushing was I wanted them to not, at every turn, it was like a question of like, how do we make this not feel like a horse with a horn? How do we do something different with it? And one of the things that it took a long time to figure out, and I remember it happened just in like a couple weeks before we started shooting. One of the things I really wanted was when they're prowling for them not to look like horses moving, because horses moving don't feel very intimidating, but
Mm,
they actually look like big cats, which was a really big challenge for our animators
interesting.
to because they essentially needed to break the spine was the language they used of the unicorn of a horse so that the shoulders have a little more give to them.
Yeah,
Like they
right.
go up and down, and you get that kind of like classic big cat predatory prowling like
It's like
shoulder
the
waggles.
car scene when they're going around the car. I feel like you can really see that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few scenes where you really see it, and those were, they're spotlights because when they start galloping in full stride, they do kind of have an equine gait. But there is something in this slow prowling, sniffing around moments where, we really wanted it to feel predatory in a way that was uncanny to see a horse moving like that. And I
Yeah.
remember the first time the lead animator, Patricia, showed me that, it was just like we'd been talking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. I was like, I don't know, how do we do this? And they had to really dissect the whole model they'd built and kind of rebuild it in the shoulder area. And it was just like a really remarkable feat of animation that
Yeah.
I don't know. The first time I saw that, I was just like, I think it was at the end of a long prep day, and I was in Budapest and having a glass of wine or something, and I was just like, "Yeah, we did it. You guys did it. Like, yes." And I knew it was gonna be cool. So, I don't know. And then you see the puppets. The first time I saw the puppets, it was
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I was going into the puppet workshop as they were building them, but we did a
Mm.
show and tell for the cast right before we started shooting, and there was something very like I don't know. That's why you get into making movies is for like to see
Yeah.
magic, you know?
Yeah.
And so when you see these puppeteers working these puppets, which are so large and just impressive and detailed and beautiful, and just have a ton of craft baked into them, there's something so exciting when you get to see that come to life.
And especially from the guys at Weta as well, like they are truly geniuses at what they do. I love that you talked about movie magic because, as you can probably tell, I'm a fan of films. I worked in a blockbuster for 5 years. It was like the best job I've ever had. Probably will be the best job I ever had.
Sorry for
And
your
you,
loss.
and this is probably where most of that started, to be honest. So as soon as they announced we were closing down, I was like, I'm sad, but I'm taking all of this with me. You wear the influences of the movies I guess you love right on the sleeve of this film with Cameron and Ridley Scott and Spielberg. And I'm curious to know, you strike me as someone who probably loved the video store too, growing up. So what was Alex's rentals? What were those ones that you were picking up that sort of not necessarily just inspired you to be a filmmaker, but just those movies that proved that movie magic was real to you as well?
I mean, it's a lot of the films you were talking about. It's so funny. I remember at one point it was like the Blockbuster had implemented, I think, competing with Netflix when Netflix was just the DVDs. They'd
Yep, yep,
implemented this like unlimited rental policy where it was like you take two DVDs out at once and you could take back as many as you want, just keep bringing them back.
yep.
And I remember I like took my savings. I was in high school and I took my savings and I got a DVD burner because one of my brothers was really into computers and he was like, "Yeah, yeah, you got me this illegal software to
Oh
And
man, I remember those days.
I just remember in summertime, me and my other brother would just like go back and forth to the Blockbuster and be like, "I got two DVDs, rip, go back." And we did this like 8 DVDs in a night. We did this for weekends of just like building the most extensive DVD
Yeah.
library, and I still have some of those burned DVDs,
Oh man.
which is just so funny. I mean, this movie, to your question now, sorry,
No, no,
to
no,
that
that's all
tangent.
good.
This movie is like a real love letter to the like. There were a few moments that got me excited about writing the movie, and one was like, the realization about unicorn lore and getting to explore that and realizing it's a context to have a new creature feature. And another one was, when I was describing it to myself and to friends, I started thinking about it in the context of, Spielberg and Cameron and Carpenter and Ridley Scott. And yeah, I got really excited when I realized it was my opportunity to make one of their kind of movies, the kind of
Yeah.
movies that made me fall in love with filmmaking. I can't tell you how many times I watched the making of Aliens, like that behind the scenes featurette.
Yes.
Like that was just something that, I grew up without any connections to the film industry, no artists, like professional artists in my life whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so, and I loved movies my whole life, but as a teen, I started realizing, like, watching those sort of featurettes and realizing, like, oh, people do this. Someone gets to like make these things, and it just became such an escape. So I don't know. I could rattle off all the movies, but like, I
Yeah.
mean, Aliens, The Abyss is one that's really big for me. The Thing,
So
Close
good.
Encounters. It
Yes.
was one that Doug Trumbull's work on that is like revelatory and like this personal story threaded through the center of that.
Yes.
Um, I'm more, I get those are like, obviously Jurassic Park, E.T.,
Hmm.
Alien is one I've just seen. I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen Alien, but then also, more contemporary creature features like The Host, Attack the Block. Shaun of the Dead is one movie that I just like loved when it
Yep.
came out. I just watched it endlessly. It's not I don't know if zombies count as creatures, do they? It's something I've debated
Yeah.
when thinking about like Romero, in the
Yeah.
context of like people asking, because there's
Is
a
it a
lot of Night
creature
of the Living
feature?
Dead in this
Yeah.
movie too. Yeah, I don't know if
So
a zombie is
interesting.
a creature. It's a question, but I have there's something about these movies that get to bring in all this cinematic magic and treat it through a populist kind of popcorn lens that I don't know. It's like true escapism, and that's sort of what I was hoping to make.
And I think that came across, man. I think the influences are there, but it is like a Spielberg for now, which is awesome. And the fact that Spielberg's still making films and you're making films that are like that is just the crossover is awesome. I'm so close to my time. I've got about a minute left, and I really want to quickly ask one question. It can be a yes or no answer. You spoke about the opening scene, but there is also like a cold opening scene on the plane that just felt
Yeah.
very specific. I think we can just all understand that. Do you have a plane deboarding story? Is that come from somewhere very personal to you?
That just comes from my own anxiety. I don't know why traveling makes me anxious.
No,
Like,
I'm
and
the
it's
same.
yeah, I know. And it's so funny because I travel with my wife who's like, most of the time I travel with my wife who's like chronically nice. And it's sometimes I'm like so anxious, and it's great to travel with her, obviously, but like sometimes I'm like so anxious or stressed out on a flight, and she's like the nicest person to every stewardess or flight attendant or
Yeah.
anyone taking our tickets, like anyone. And sometimes I'm like, can't we just be stressed for a second? And she's like so nice. No, I don't know. That wasn't specifically based on anything other than I don't know. I think my DP told me a story about how he had the stairs couldn't fit on a plane one time, and they
I
didn't know what
laughed at
that.
that line so much.
Yeah, no one knew what it meant, and it was one of those situations. But no, I don't know. That scene was, I was trying to hopefully because the movie has so much dialogue at the front of it. I wanted to open with something that hopefully was visual and encapsulated,
Yeah.
ultimately the dilemma that this character's in, without
Yeah.
dialogue. Just to tell you, here's what he wants to be able to enjoy, and here's what his anxiety about work won't let him enjoy this beautiful moment with his daughter.
it came across as that. Like I said, man, this movie was so much fun. I had such a blast watching it. I'm so glad it's getting a theatrical release, not in just in general, but in Australia as well. I hope we get to chat for whatever you've got coming up next, Alex. I really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much for
Oh,
chatting
thanks,
today.
Nick. I appreciate it. Thank you for the enthusiasm and positivity. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much.